question about that. I know that's partially a shrinking population, but I also know youth unemployment is tremendously high. It's so high to, they were reporting it like 21%. Some people thought it was more like 40, 50%. Now they've just stopped reporting it entirely. So there are people who want jobs, but they can't find jobs.
And so this actually gets into a couple of issues. First of all, China has understandably placed a very real emphasis on improving higher education. I was part of that. I do think there have been real advances in the quality of Chinese higher education. But one of the outgrowths of that is that there are a lot of youth that do not want to take factory jobs. Okay. And so that still is an enormous foundation to the Chinese economy. So if you are leaving in China as a college graduate, there may be jobs, just not necessarily the jobs, college graduates want to take. Another issue has been, and this gets to one of the inputs of Chinese economy is innovation. Basically, how much more productive is an economy, and according to most metrics, the Chinese economy since really let's as a simple dividing line, let's say the global financial crisis, has not become significantly more productive. And what we mean by more productive is you have more people, you have more machines, but are people using those machines effectively? Okay, so that I, as a worker, am becoming more productive. Okay, and actually, productivity in China has actually been quite poor. According to some metrics, it might even be negative. At the very least, it's very, very slow. And so, as people decline, and as the number of, let's say, physical inputs, and when we talk about physical inputs, we're talking machines, things like that. The number of physical machines or hard capital isn't growing as fast. Can we be more productive with what we have? And that's one of the major problems, that China hasn't been productive. They aren't going to be productive because, and this is where you get back to what you said earlier about Communist Party policies. Economies aren't productive if they aren't competitive. Okay, if they can't be innovative, if they can't be creative. Okay. Well, even this year, you look at where the overwhelming amount of bank financing is going, it's going to state-owned enterprises and state-linked enterprises, okay? State-owned enterprises, whether it's China or anywhere else, are not known for their productivity, okay? And so you actually look at the Chinese economy, and there are pockets. I want to emphasize there are pockets or sectors where you see very innovative and productive things going on, technological breakthroughs. As an economy, the economy very clearly is neither innovative nor productive, and unless that changes, you're going to see significant economic stagnation.
So what is the like practical outcome of having an unproductive, like you say productivity is negative? What does that mean for, people living in China?
So think about it. This actually has a direct impact on wages. And the best way I can think about it is let's assume that you work in a factory, and you say, hey, I have a sewing machine. Okay, well, I can sew X number of T-shirts per day because your boss is going to pay you $1 for every T-shirt that you sew or something like that. Okay, and then the boss says, well, and then you say to your boss, well, hey, boss, I actually wrote a program where I can actually control 10 sewing machines at the same time. Will you still pay me the same amount per T-shirt that I make if my computer code can run 10 different sewing machines at the same time? And he'll say, yeah, I'll pay you the same amount per T-shirt. And now you as a worker, because you wrote a piece of code, you can actually make a lot more money. Okay, that's an example of productivity. Or maybe you know how to control that sewing machine, and you become a better sewer, so you can use that one sewing machine, so you can make more money to turn out more T-shirts. Okay, that's productivity. And at the end of the day, that's what drives wages. Okay, because think about it this way: if we buy 10 sewing machines, we still got to pay for those 10 sewing machines. whether it's in an implied, what we call an implied hourly rate, because that sewing machine, I have to pay somebody, on a loan or whatever for those sewing machines. So people make more money by becoming more productive. Okay, whether that's becoming a better sewer, whether that's writing code to control 10 sewing machines, that's how wages grow. And that's one thing that we're actually not seeing in the Chinese economy. We're continuing to see low single digit wage growth and household income growth in China. And so when we talk about the Chinese economy growing at, say, 5-6%, what we're seeing in China is actually wage and household income growth a couple of percentage points lower, about, let's say, officially 3 to 4%.
So you said there's three main parts to an economy, and the first one was the number of people, and the second one is productivity. What's the third part?
That's the hardware capital. And so this is one of the things is when China has gone out and spent a lot of money on hard assets, whether it's a new university building, whether it's a new machine, things like that. And so one of the things is those have to be productive. Okay, those have to, we don't like to think of it, but even those assets, whether it's a bridge, whether it's a road, something like that, that needs to generate a rate of return to either pay for itself, or if you're a sewing machine, you don't just go out and buy a sewing machine to sit there. You have to pay for that machine in some way. So that machine has to turn out X number of T-shirts. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing with a bridge. And the example that people use is like high-speed rail, okay, or a bridge. And they say, well, it lends itself to social benefit, and that may well be true. That absolutely may well be true. But then that still has to be paid for somehow, maybe tax revenue, tax expenditures, or something like that. Otherwise, if those assets aren't being used, and if there isn't some type of revenue being assigned to that, that simply means that debts aren't being paid, banks don't have the capital to lend, things like that. And that's actually what we're seeing in the financial sector, is banks being very short of liquidity, banks being very short of capital, because they aren't being repaid as much as they should.
So one of the hard assets you mentioned is universities. So the Chinese government has spent a lot of resources pushing higher education. And so, it's building or expanding universities, hiring faculty, and then, paying for the expenses of a student to be in a university for additional time. That is, maybe it's 4 years or whatever, but that's just, there's a lot of expenses that go into that, right? And so that has to contribute to productivity. And the idea, I guess, originally is that if you have a lot more educated people in China, then when they go find jobs after university, they will be more productive at those jobs. They'll know how to program 10 sewing machines, and so they'll increase productivity. But what's actually happening is you have millions of people who went through this very expensive university paid for by the government, and now there's no jobs for them. So they can't even be minimally productive.
Yes, absolutely. And so this is why, there's stories of, whether it's university graduates staying home or opting to open a noodle stand or something like that. And one of the issues is that these are people that just aren't allowed to be competitive. And one of the things that always amazed me when, because I would sit in on, the admissions process every year. That was part of my job, is just how competitive the Chinese university process was at every stage, undergraduate, graduate. I mean, it was amazingly competitive. And one of the things that the school, and this was, I think pretty universal in other schools I talked to and in my colleagues, people took great pride in that the university process was a very clean process, and it was very competitive, and it was very interesting. Why? Because people all throughout China felt that this was maybe the one chance in their entire life when it was on a level playing field with everybody. Okay,
So it's a meritocracy.
It was a meritocracy. It was a meritocracy. It was one of the only times where people felt everybody was on an even playing field.
Like,
And
even if you're the son or daughter of a communist official, that wouldn't help you that much.
Because you still have to get a good Gaokao score in order to get into college.
yes, absolutely. And so, I remember, my first year in China, I was talking with a student, and she told me she went to Peking University as an undergrad, and she came from a relatively populous province, and she told me she placed 10th in her province. And so, being, the newbie that I was at the time, I said, "Oh, you placed in the top 10 percentile. That's great." And she looked at me like I was a complete idiot, because there were probably, I went back and looked at the numbers. I just did some ballpark numbers. There were probably anywhere from about 500,000 to 750,000 kids that took the Gaokao in her province that year. And I said, and she looked at me, she's like, "No, professor, I placed 10th." Okay. And her parents were, as best I could tell, poor, relatively poor, not wealthy or anything like that. But people took great pride in the university system in China, that it was very equitable. And if you got a good score, you got a good score, no matter your background. And that was one of the few times people could compete evenly against anyone.
And so now, facing very little prospects of no jobs, for the men, probably no wife, since there's a huge gender imbalance. So what is the impact of this?
If you have a higher education, I think like the worst problem for men is actually like kind of like rural, less educated men are not going to find.
Yeah. But I mean, if
Yeah.
you're a college graduate who's staying at home and can't find a job and has no money,
Or can't buy real estate,
that's
still tough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in one of the things I've heard is I've heard people with conspiracy theories about, why are all these Chinese coming across the border, from Mexico and things like that. And look, there statistically, there's probably some bad actors in that group. Okay, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. But I've heard stories in other countries of the number of Chinese, even crossing into Vietnam has grown significantly, trying to get across the border. And so what this tells me is that there's significant pressures, and there just aren't jobs. And so a lot of people are saying, I need to go someplace to go get a job and have prospects for a better life.